The War of 1812. President James Madison was inaugurated in March of 1809. This was the Virginia dynasty. Madison was the third in a line of 4 Virginia presidents between 1789 and 1829. It was strongly Jeffersonian in his views. Makin's Bill No. 2 was adopted by Congress in 1810 to replace the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. The Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 would expire within a year. It proclaimed the U.S. would trade with all other nations except Britain and France. The purpose of Makin's bill was to entice Britain or France to repeal commercial restrictions. The U.S. would implement non-importation rules against the nation that did not repeal the restrictions. Napoleon seized the opportunity with hopes of getting the U.S. in a war with Britain. He announced in August 1810 that French decrees had been repealed. Madison believed he had no other choice but to accept Napoleon's gesture and gave the British 3 months to follow suit, or the U.S. would restore non-importation. The British were angered and demanded U.S. withdrawal restrictions on Britain until France had withdrawn all their restrictions on American shipping. The Warhawks. The 12th Congress met late in 1811. It was deeply divided, although the Democratic Republicans were still in control. It differed from past Congresses in that there were new young leaders from the South and the West. It was strongly nationalistic and wanted war with Britain to achieve the glory their fathers had in the Revolutionary War. The 2 key figures of the 12th Congress were Henry Clay from Kentucky, who was elected Speaker of the House, and John C. Calhoun, who was elected as a representative of South Carolina. The Battle of Tippecanoe was a Western war between Native Americans and Western Warhawks of the U.S. The U.S. had wiped out renewed Indian resistance against white settlers in the western wilderness. 2 Shawnee twin brothers, Tecumseh and the Prophet, organized the Confederacy of all the tribes east of the Mississippi. Tecumseh was a noted warrior and perhaps most gifted organizer of Native Americans in U.S. history. General William H. Harrison advanced with 1,000 men and advanced upon the Indian headquarters. He had repelled a surprise Indian attack at Tippecanoe in November 1811 and torched the settlement. His victory essentially ended the Indian threat, and a formal agreement was signed. This allowed further expansion westward, and the Indians were first pushed further west. The Warhawks desired the U.S. now to attack Canada and to remove further Indian threats. Canada was seen as vulnerable to attack, as Britain was preoccupied with Napoleon in Europe. Southern expansionists desired Spanish Florida, Britain's ally. The Warhawks were also outraged at British impressment. Daniel Webster, a Federalist from New Hampshire, however, spoke out against entry into the war. He spoke on the behalf of New England manufacturers and their general interests. The U.S. declared war on Britain in June of 1812. Representatives from pro-British New England, as well as the Middle Atlantic states, opposed the war. There were 4 major reasons why the U.S. fought Britain, even though France had committed nearly as many maritime offenses. The reason number 1, they were traditional Republicans who had partiality towards France. Number 2, the visibility of British impressments and arming of Indians had angered many. Number 3, the Chesapeake and Leopard affair was a major offense to the U.S. government. Number 4, the lure of British Canada with its timber, fishing, and pelts was a major economic pull. Resentful New Englanders were also hurt by the U.S. war effort. They believed British actions were old and the wrongs had been exaggerated. They also had a strong dislike of France. New England merchants, who were still making handsome profits from the war, also were dependent upon England. They opposed the acquisition of Canada, which would add more agrarian states, which would only further Jeffersonians and Democratic Republicans. New England investors also probably lent money to the British than they had to the U.S. The New England farmers also sent huge quantities of supplies and foodstuffs to Canada, helping Britain to invade New York. New England governors refused to permit their militias to serve outside their states. The War of 1812. This was a small war. 6,000 Americans were killed or wounded. The mostly Canadians fought Americans, and very few British were involved. One of America's most poorly fought wars on land, the nation was militarily unprepared for war. Its attack on Canada was a complete failure. Washington, D.C. had been burned by the British, and the British nearly won large territories in New York areas and New England. There was also great national disunity in the U.S. The Federalists were working to undermine the war effort. In spite of that, there were some American victories. The U.S. Navy was influential in removing the Royal Navy from the Great Lakes regions. Andrew Jackson emerged as a national hero for defending New Orleans, and William H. Harrison became a hero and later would go on to become president. Another shortcoming of the war was that the war had ended in a stalemate. Although the U.S. was victorious, they gained some respect and diplomacy and military strength abroad in Europe. It was later dubbed the Second War for Independence. The Federalists ended with the War of 1812 due to their sectionalism and talk of separation from the Union. The Native Americans had major losses during the War of 1812. They lost vast areas of forested land north of the Ohio River. American industry was also stimulated as they had broken off engagements with British manufacturing. The Embargo Act hurt the economy of the U.S. greatly. The charter for the National Bank expired in 1811, even though it was mostly needed at this time. The regular army was also incredibly inadequate, and was supplemented by poorly trained militia. Britain had possessed the greatest navy in the world at this time, using its ability to maintain a blockade on American Atlantic ports for most of the war, which caused significant opposition to the war. Jefferson's fleet of privateers and small ships were inadequate in dealing with the naval powers of the British. The U.S. attempt to attack on Canada was a strategic failure. Americans falsely believed Canadians would easily crumble. 80% of Canadians in Upper Canada were post-revolution loyalists. If the U.S. had in fact concentrated on Montreal, Canada would have fallen. The fight for the Great Lakes. The British were unable to sail its fleet past Niagara Falls. Thus, a naval arms race resulted in the Great Lakes region. Oliver Hazard Perry built a fleet of ships on the shores of the Lake Erie hastily during the winter and summer of 1813, outbuilding the British. He managed to capture a British fleet in a raging battle on Lake Erie, September 10, 1813. The retreating army, defeated by William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Thames in October 1813 near Toronto. By 1814, Napoleon was subdued, and the British began to concentrate on North America. The British prepared for a large invasion in New York along the Hudson River Valley. 34-year-old Thomas Macdonough defeated a stronger British fleet near Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814. The British were forced to withdraw back to Quebec. Thus, Upper New York was saved from conquest, and New England was saved from further engagements. It also profoundly affected the current negotiations in Europe to end the war. Washington, D.C. was burned when a second formidable British force landed in the Chesapeake Bay area in August 1814. The British set fire to most public buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. This was retaliation for American burning Canadian capital at York. Madison and his aides were forced to flee into the surrounding hills. Guys, ask me next about the story about Dolly Madison.